There we go. Just as I promised. Okay. Okay, everybody, who's here, and I know other people are going to be joining us as they can. I'm just delighted. I can't tell you how happy I am to introduce to you today two wonderful speakers. We have Diane Wilson, who's joining us from Minnesota. Diane is a writer, Dakota Nation author. You'll have seen her bio in the poster that you had to join this session. So I'm going to keep the introductions quite brief, but Diane will be speaking first. And then secondly, right immediately after Diane, we're going to have Hannah Imlach, Dr. Hannah Imlach, who has just recently received her PhD. And she will be speaking about her PhD work and her partnership with the RSPB, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, and work that was based at Loch Lomond. But she will follow after Diane. We're going to keep our Q&A, questions and answers, and group discussion to follow the two speakers. So if you jot down those questions as you're hearing and thinking about things, um, please would you hang on to those thoughts and questions because we're going to have an opportunity up to a full hour after their talks. So without further ado, Diane, I'm going to hand over to you and let you take it away. Oh, you're still muted, Diane.
Okay, can you hear and see me now?
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Hamatakiapi, Diane Wilson, Amakiapia, Bide Wakantuano Yate, Hamatahanya, Sichangu Oyate Ed Omawapia. So, hello, all my relatives. My name is Diane Wilson. I'm a descendant of the Dakota people here in Minnesota, and I'm enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. And I am honored to be speaking to you today from the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people here in Minnesota. And I always like to introduce myself as a creative writer and a gardener, because that means that I take care of seeds and bogs and stories, hence the title of my talk today. Um, and I like to think that the hands-on work I do with seeds and bogs as a gardener leads to then the books that I write. And what really resonates with me in the work that place does is that intersection of memory and place and identity. So I think a lot about stories as a writer, and I believe that we all come from stories and that they are shaping and defining our relationship to the world that we live in. From our time as children, when our parents are reading books to us, those books are informing the worldview that we will grow up into and our relationship to the earth. And stories are so powerful. They can inspire us, they can move us to act, they can educate, but they can also be used to erase and distort and create kind of an apocalyptic understanding of the world. So it's very important to me to be aware of the stories that we share, because in that way we are creating the world that we live in. Okay, so right now I have to figure out how to advance. Oh, hang on. Oh, there we go. Oops. Okay, so I figured there would be people who were not familiar with where Minnesota is, and apologize for the quality of that map, but it gives you the sense for where Minnesota is located. And this is the ancestral homeland for Dakota people. We have 4 reservations in the southern part of the state, and they spread across other reservations into South Dakota and North Dakota. And all together, we are known as the Ocheti Shakowin, or Seven Council Fires. And as a Dakota writer, I'm descended from people who were and continue to be oral storytellers. And today there is a tendency to regard oral storytelling as a precursor to writing, a less sophisticated form of communication and knowledge keeping. But for Dakota people, one of our most important teachings is Mitakuye Owasi. And that's a phrase that means we are all related. And this is a kinship-centered relationship with all beings, everyone outside our windows, the plants, animals, water, land, they're all relatives. And being a good relative is one of the most important teachings for Dakota people, and it's central to our culture. Our kinship rules are tribal law. And so, one of the reasons why oral storytelling was so effective is because it is relational, and that affirms that teaching of Mitakuye Owasi. You have to be connected in order to do oral storytelling. And so I wanted to share this book by Dakota author Teresa Peterson, who talks a little bit about the two kinds of stories that Dakota people shared. And one was the Wicho Oyake that share our history, migrations, and genealogy. And the other is the Hitun Kankapi, and that's myths and legends. And these are the stories that are often told in winter, and they're the ones that teach our values. They remind us how we are supposed to behave as human beings. And often stories featured very important relationships with plants and animals, and they often served as teachers who are pointing out important lessons for human beings. And so that's me in my garden. And I think of my own work then as a descendant of that oral storytelling tradition. So, but these are written stories that also preserve Dakota history and culture. But I have a special focus on the impact of assimilation, especially with regard to those teachings that were handed down in our traditional stories. And at the heart of my work is a commitment to cultural recovery. And that was inspired by a Dakota historian, David Larson, who said, when you know what was taken away, then you can reclaim it. And in my most recent book, the novel The Seed Keeper, that explores the question of how returning to our indigenous seeds and foods can help restore our relationship with the earth. So, our ancestral memories and stories tell us that human beings once held an original agreement with seeds, and that's where we agreed to take care of each other. And seeds have been collaborating with humans for thousands of years, at least 9,000 years ago. And in many tribes, women were responsible for gardens, for feeding their families, and for protecting their family seed bundle, which is the seeds that have been passed down for many generations, often from mother to daughter. But when European settlers arrived in Minnesota in the 1800s, they brought with them a very different relationship with the land, where Indigenous people believed that the earth could not be owned. The newly formed government here in the United States introduced the Western concept of property ownership. And through nearly 400 treaties, tribes were displaced from land they had lived on for thousands of years and moved onto reservations. And our indigenous seeds and gardens were replaced then with an agriculture system that has come to rely on growing limited crops, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and genetically modified seeds. And if any of you have seen the movie Seeds, the Untold Story, then you know that by 2015, 94% of the world's seed varieties had disappeared. And in this new system, no longer were our seeds or plants or animals or water regarded as relatives as we were taught in our traditional stories, which led me to understand that how our communities eat and how our food is grown is central to all of our cultures, and it's also intimately connected to the environmental and civil rights issues that we face. But despite all those challenges that our indigenous seeds faced, there were always a few native families who held on to their seeds and continued to garden. And in 1999, some of those seeds made their way to this tiny little bare bones garden south of the Twin Cities called Dream of Wild Health. And as a gardener, as soon as I heard about those seeds, I knew that I had to go and be part of this work. And when I look back, I believe that those seeds were calling us, that it was time for them to be returned to our communities. And this was really a life-changing moment for me that would shape the work that I would do the next 20 years, as well as my writing. And I was fascinated by the stories these seeds were carrying. They had 800-year-old traditional tobacco. There was corn that was descended from the original Cherokee Trail of Tears corn and Hopi black turtle beans from the Southwest. And these seeds were also carrying stories of each season. So how much rain fell? How hard did the wind blow? And even the ancestors who planted them, who held those seeds in their hands. And sometimes they would put a seed in their mouth before they planted it to moisten it. So we have this beautiful genetic connection with our ancestors as well. And and then just that ancient wisdom of the mother plant herself. So to me, that's when I fell in love really with these seeds. And after I volunteered for a few years, then they hired me as the director in 2008. And shortly after, they had bought this 10-acre farm that you see in these photos. And there I was blessed to spend time with Native elders and youth and their families, farmers and the seeds themselves. And together we were learning how to reclaim an indigenous relationship with the land. And what I mean by that is that many of our families, including mine, had grown up in boarding schools or public schools or churches that taught us a worldview that regarded human beings as the dominant species with a God-given right to make use of the earth as we chose. But at Dream of Wild Health, we treated plants and animals, the soil and the water as our relatives. And in that worldview, human beings are actually the least at the bottom. They're at the bottom of the order because we are the most dependent of everyone. And so every day we started in circle with prayer. And one of our elders, Ernie Whiteman, would open up each day with prayers, and we would offer tobacco with gratitude to the soil and the plants and the animals. And so that every day before we began work, we offered our gratitude. And so when we garden this way with reverence, it reminds us of that teaching, Matakuye Owasi, and that being a good relative is fundamental to our relationship with the earth. And when we garden this way, then our food truly becomes our medicine. And this is one of my favorite quotes by Devin Mahisua, who is a scholar and an activist and a writer. The recovery of the people is tied to the recovery of food, since food itself is medicine, not only for the body, but for the soul, and for the spiritual connection to history, ancestors, and the land. And so today, that tiny little garden where I first volunteered to work with seeds has grown into a successful native-led 30-acre organic farm. And they are leading some of the food sovereignty work that is happening in native communities across the country. And at the heart of their work is a belief that we are healing ourselves, our ancestors, and our future generations when we're doing this work. So, as a writer, I realized that this is the story that I wanted to share through my writing, how we can reclaim Indigenous foods and a spiritually centered relationship with the earth that has allowed Native people to thrive for thousands of years. And when Arapaho elder Ernie Whiteman told me, if you can control the food, you can control the people, that's when I realized that I could tell the story of Dakota people through the history of what happened to our food. And that's when I started writing The Seed Keeper. And as I was writing this novel, I thought about our ancestors, how they had protected these seeds at all cost because they knew that, like our children, these seeds are our future. But yet, these seeds are facing a mass extinction at the same time that the earth is facing a climate crisis. So I believe that if we look beyond these news headlines, what we'll see instead is a crisis of relationship, where the community of care that we created through upholding Matakuye Owasi has been dismantled and disregarded for the sake of profit. And when we change this relationship, when we open our hearts to other beings, then we also are opening our hearts to grief. Because so many of these beautiful, exquisitely tender lives have been lost just for our convenience. And as human beings, how do we respond to the grief of so many relatives being lost? What actions can we take when the challenges we face are global in their immensity? And how can one person make a difference? So these are the questions that I struggle with each day until I step outside my front door. And right now we're almost spring, and I can see sandhill cranes returning on migration. Yesterday we had a warm spell. I could hear a few peeper frogs beginning to waken. And that's when I remember that I am responsible for the relatives who are still here. And I'm also a Dakota grandmother, which means that I'm responsible for teaching my children and grandchildren to be good relatives and to make sure that they live their lives believing that they can make a difference. So the question that I ask throughout The Seed Keeper is how our relationship with seeds has changed over generations and what that change means for us as human beings and for seeds themselves. But, okay, so 20 years before before I published The Seed Keeper, back when I just I was a wannabe writer, my husband, who was an artist, Jim Dinamy, we moved out of the Twin Cities where we had both lived most of our lives up to this 10 acres, about an hour north of the cities not far from the St. Croix River. And when we moved here, as city people, all we could see was this lush wilderness, this beautiful green space. It was incredible. And we have this long gravel driveway, and as you drive in, there was a majestic white oak tree. It had to be over 100 years old, perfectly shaped, that seemed to just greet us every time we drove in. And so we were also, the 10 acres also included a 6-acre tamarack bog, which we knew nothing about, as well as 3 acres of fields with scattered trees and shrubs, and then a remnant of hardwood forest that we shared with our neighbors. So by far, the most beautiful part of the land I live on is that 6-acre tamarack bog. And when we were living in the cities, there was a single tamarack tree in the backyard. And in the spring, the ruby-crowned kinglets used to stop by on their migration to eat the aphids on this tamarack. So when we heard about this land that had a tamarack bog, we drove up after an ice storm and we bought it on the spot. So even though we knew nothing about bogs, we knew that we had to live there. And so what this photo is showing, what is a floating platform of sphagnum moss that supports the stand of tamarack trees, and this is surrounded by a moat of water that fluctuates depending on spring to late summer water levels. And I've only gone into the bog once in summer and with a friend, and we saw a lot of pitcher plants, cranberries, cotton grass, heather laurel, and then in the spring, standing on the hill, I've seen moccasin flowers and calla lilies. So what I learned about this beautiful little bog is that it was carved maybe 10,000 years ago or more as the glaciers were beginning to recede from Minnesota. And they left behind our legacy of water, carving out 11,000 lakes, 6,000 rivers and streams, and 18 million acres of wetlands. And this is the most of any state in the lower 48. The only state that has more wetlands than we do is Alaska. And these wetlands are very hardworking. They provide this critical habitat for birds and other wildlife. They retain floodwater, they filter pollutants, and they prevent erosion. And in my bog, they're supporting sandhill cranes, red-winged blackbirds, pileated woodpeckers. They're just a few of the birds that rely on this habitat. But too often we measure the value of these complex communities for their ability to serve humanity. The UN, they actually cover about 3% of the Earth, but they hold 30% of the carbon, which led the UN Environment, the lead coordinator of the Global Peatlands Initiative, to state that peatlands store twice as much carbon as all the world's forests. And they urged countries to protect these ecosystems as a way to mitigate climate change. And while this is true, defining the significance of a bog as a carbon sink is a very Western way of seeing wetlands as a resource, not as a relative. And this perspective misses her right to exist as an autonomous living community. It misses the beautiful complexity of this ecosystem. She doesn't need us at all. And the deeper underlying principles of reciprocity and natural succession. And it was this kind of thinking of bogs and wetlands as resources that led to the tragic loss of more than half of Minnesota's original wetlands that were destroyed after the first settlers arrived in the 1800s. 11 million acres were drained primarily for farmland and housing developments. And it wasn't until 1991 that Minnesota finally enacted the Wetland Conservation Act to protect one of our most important ecosystems. So among the 7 million acres of remaining wetlands is the 6-acre bog in my backyard, which appears to be a healthy, stable community. So when we first moved onto this land, what we didn't know was that the farmer across the road had used our fields for grazing cattle, and they were allowed to overgraze the land, which wiped out diverse seedlings and opened up opportunity for enthusiastic volunteers such as prickly ash and buckthorn. And because we were city people, we were very ignorant about what we were seeing or how we were supposed to be caring for this land. And so I really focused my energy on planting perennial pollinator gardens around the house we built a fenced seed garden where I could grow out some of the seeds that I had been given by Dream of Wild Health. Um, we also planted trees. We planted 75 tree seedlings, but overnight, 50 of them were eaten by deer, which was a big lesson. So we managed to protect ultimately about 15 white pine and white spruce, as well as this willow tree that you see on the right. But what you're also looking at in these photos is the overwhelming dominance of prickly ash and buckthorn. And the reason that willow tree looks like a solid column of green is because it has been encircled by prickly ash. And so, for about the first 20 years that we lived here, we built studios, and I worked as a writer and for Native nonprofits. And my husband worked as a painter and developed a career as an internationally um, known artist. And this left us very little time to work on the land aside from my gardens. And while we were not paying attention, that's when the prickly ash moved in. And it took over that front hill where we drove in every day to greet that oak tree. It encircled the oak tree until one day it just collapsed. And so one of my biggest concerns about prickly ash and buckthorn was the possibility that in drought, if a drought were to be sustained or in that around the bog, that it could create conditions where prickly ash could actually move into it could eventually move into the bog itself. And so we had to face the reality that this lush green paradise was actually being dominated by just a few overly enthusiastic plants. And while I was a gardener, but I really had no idea how to interpret or what I was supposed to do with this landscape. So it wasn't until my husband passed away 4 years ago that I decided to focus on our on the land renewal work as a way to understand loss and grief and to heal both myself and the land. So I made a trip to Costa Rica where I learned about the concept of natural succession. And that was a really important part of their work to restore rainforests that had also been clear cut and devastated by agriculture. And when I got home, my hope was that this idea of natural succession could be a practical framework for restoring the health of my land. And in the beginning, my very naive hope was if I just understood where my land was in its succession, that I could figure out that maybe prickly ash was just a phase, and that the next phase would be the healthy, diverse ecosystem that I was hoping to create on this land. But, because I'm a writer, not a botanist, I don't have any of the training that would maybe have helped me move more quickly to a solution. And I really didn't want to do anything that would just make things worse. But I finally had to recognize that with oak trees dying and fields that were covered with prickly ash and buckthorn, that this succession process that was unfolding could not lead to a healthy ecosystem. Prickly ash and buckthorn were creating an inhospitable environment for any other successive trees. And if I didn't intervene, I could see a future in which this land would be reduced to just a few homogeneous species. So I went to one of the conferences I attended was hosted by Pollinators Alliance, and I heard an ecologist, Steve Tomford, who said that with regard to a declining forest overrun by colonizing plants, that system collapse is a narrative. Now, that is a concept that as a writer, I felt I can embrace. So, in my mind, he meant that recovering land also means recovering her story, and that this is a narrative that needs to include all of us as collaborators. And it's a story that is written in a wordless language of plants and animals. So this was the story that I needed to find. And it's a story of both loss and recovery, of believing that even though land had suffered due to human activity, this same land needed human intervention to help thrive again. And when I mentioned my questions about how best to protect the Tamarack bog to my Lakota friend, Juanita Espinoza, she told me, take some of that tobacco you've been growing and offer it to the bog. Ask her what she needs. And Juanita was reminding me to pay attention to the sacred, to the spiritual relationship that needs to be foundational to this work. So, prayer and offering tobacco are practices that honor the sacredness of all life and acknowledge that reciprocity is essential to creating that caring relationship with the earth. So, in that way, I learned that before I would do anything to the land, even to prickly ash, which I have to admit had become something like a nemesis to me by that point, I went out with my tobacco and I offered prayers to prickly ash, and I thanked her for preserving the soil, for offering a place for birds to nest, for taking care of the land in the meantime. And I offered those prayers before I would go in and do that removal work. And in this way, this is how we start to change the story, as well as change the future for the land. That photo on the right is the same, that same willow tree. Once I had persuaded my friends, my relatives, everyone I could lure to my fields with their loppers to come and help with that removal work. And you look how happy she looks as a tree. And on the left are two farmers that I hired from Dream of Wild Health at the end of the season. That's one of at least a dozen piles of prickly ash that we had, that they mostly had lopped. And even those piles were creating habitat for birds and other wildlife. So for the meantime, in the meantime, until I figure out bringing back cultural fire to the landscape, those piles are just going to remain. And I have to say that in doing this work, it helped me realize that I might not be able to do anything about melting glaciers or some of the really global level climate changes, but I can make significant change in my own backyard. And most importantly, this work is helping me create a community. Yes, a community of people who all love bogs, and this is really how, to me, we take care of the earth, is not by trying to do it by ourselves, but by bringing in the people who also love the work. So this is our very own Mary Modine here, stylish bog trotter, and Chris Baumler. And the three of us went to Ireland and Sweden last summer, specifically to tour bogs and learn more about these ecosystems. And this is a way we're creating new collaborations with artists and writers. And Chris and I have also co-hosted International Bog Day for the past 2 summers, and people come with food, so we have a feast for the bog. They also bring gifts of art and song and music, and that's so that we are always appreciating the bog for who she is. We're remembering what it means to be a good relative, and we are sharing in that responsibility for her well-being. And this is also the bog. This is what she looks like in the fall, when right before all the needles turn a bright gold. And one of my favorite writers, Terry Tempest Williams, once wrote, "I pray to the birds because they remind me of what I love rather than what I fear." And to her words, I would add, "I pray to the land because she reminds me of who I am and the people I come from rather than what I have lost." And as I'm beginning to relearn the language of this place where I live, that's when I feel most hopeful about the future because we're relearning how to care for each other, all of us. And that's my talk for today. Pidamayaya. I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you. That was just a lovely, lovely talk. Just wonderful. Thank you. We're going to have all kinds of questions and things that we'd like to talk with you about in response to this. But as I promised before at the beginning of the session, we're going to move straight on from your presentation into Hannah's and then come back and have discussion and questions for both of you afterwards. So thank you once again. Wonderful. Thanks, Diane. And you sneaked those photos in. My Bog sister. Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, okay, now we are going to move to Dr. Hannah Imlach, and she is going to share with us the nature of her PhD in combining all of the things that we've been talking about so far with water, with birds, with relationships with all of our relatives. So, Hannah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I had a couple of
Yes.
connection wobbles there. So do let me know if my internet is wobbly and you're not catching anything. That was just so inspiring, Diane. Thank you so much for that. I'm a fellow bog enthusiast, although I'm not speaking about that work today, but really the project that inspired my PhD was an 18-month research residency in the northeast of Scotland, in the Flow Country. This Scotland's largest area of blanket bog, and I made some sculptures inspired by the seeds that are suspended within that bog, deep in the bog, that tell us histories of our botanical past. So I really relate to so much of what you were talking about. It was really wonderful. And I wonder where we can sign up for those future bog related research holidays. Sign me up, please. So to introduce myself a little bit more, I am a visual artist by training. I make sculpture, photography, film, sometimes film, writing. I do a lot of work in sketchbooks, but really my work explores environmental perception, and I'm driven by a curiosity for all different parts of the natural world. I love the ecology of lichens and seaweeds and moths and migratory birds, and these things all really inspire me. But I like to direct my work to ecologies that are undergoing some type of radical transformation. This is often through environmental restoration, processes of conservation, perhaps renewable energy transition. So over the last probably 14 years or so, I've been seeking out opportunities to work in environmental research contexts, or really kind of places that hold specialist environmental knowledge, communities, and wanting to embed some of that place-based knowledge into the artworks that I create through kind of a deep engagement with these communities. And I've done this through different residencies and structures, and but the PhD really offered me the longest period of supported time to do this. It was a unique structure between the University of Edinburgh and RSPB Scotland for me to be the RSPB's first arts humanities embedded researcher. So I had, sorry, I hope you can't hear that. My computer is making a very loud aeroplane sound. Hopefully that's not coming across. So I had 3.5, what turned into longer due to the pandemic and various things, but 3.5 years embedded within the Loch Lomond Nature Reserve to understand all the different conservation practices that were undertaking there, the diverse ecologies of Loch Lomond. For those of you who don't know, Loch Lomond has particularly interesting diversity in flora and fauna because it has It's diverse topographies, and many species are at either their most northerly or southerly extent of their ranges. So there's a kind of crossover of lowland and upland species, which give Loch Lomond a really kind of intricate mosaic of different habitats, which makes it a unique kind of challenge for conservation and restoration decision making, but also a total joy to investigate and kind of encounter. So the work that I undertook, I suppose to frame it, it was to do with ecological absence and presence. I was looking at the forms of life that you do encounter in Loch Lomond, those instances of encounter, and how I could make artworks that engaged visiting publics with all the diverse life that was in the Loch Lomond Reserve, although some of it is not readily visible. So my challenge set to me by the RSPB was to make artwork that engaged with animals and that were perhaps migratory or nocturnal or very small in scale, or difficult to encounter because of their inaccessible habitat. So these kind of forms of life which are very significant to the ecologies of Loch Lomond, but perhaps visiting publics might not readily encounter, but also to think about how we might get visiting publics to appreciate these forms of life when they don't encounter them, when we encounter absence. So the two artworks that I'm going to be sharing today, one of them addresses these kind of intense encounters, it's to do with the presence of nocturnal Lepidoptera in the woodlands of Loch Lomond, and the other one is to do with the absence of the reserve's community of Greenland white-fronted geese. And I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about one of the kind of really foundational concepts of my PhD, which is the term multi-species art. And I didn't go into my doctoral project wanting to kind of define the term of multi-species art. It's almost something that happened accidentally. I was reading through my thesis, and I realized there was a manifesto in the writing, and I just needed to make it explicit. So I realized that in the process of making these two artworks, I had been defining a way of working, and that making it into a manifesto really helped me to formalize what I felt was kind of best practice, a way of working across art and environmental conservation, to share it with others, to kind of hold myself to in terms of how work that I do in the future. So I won't share all the points of the manifesto, but I will try to weave some of those into this presentation as it goes on. To give a little bit of context to multi-species art, I came across the concept when I started reading for my project, and I was reading, I started kind of deep in ecology, following some of the species and habitats that I was encountering in Loch Lomond, and I was also reading animal studies and environmental philosophy and more than human geographies, conservation geographies, and I soon came across the kind of work of multi-species ethnographers, and a paper that many of you may have read by Eben Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich, which describes the emergence of multi-species ethnography. And it talks about how there was this significant moment in anthropology where anthropologists decided that we need to not be looking about the experiences of the human, but we need to think about the sensory realm of other beings, of different creatures, and how they intersect with our own. And they talk about this turn in anthropology being taking place in a particular place in an art exhibition, in the multi-species salon, which was a gathering together of anthropologists, of social sciences, of people from all across the humanities, but importantly, artists, and a place where there was artworks around that were being discussed, that were contributing to the conversation. And Kirksey and Helmreich described this really important transition for anthropologists, and this formation of a new way of working, which they describe as multi-species ethnography. But what bugged me was that they carry on describing the artworks that were part of this transformation as bio or eco art. And I suppose my argument is that artists are contributing to this change, and the change in how we've been thinking and writing and making work about the more than human world since this turn, and that we should be describing these art practices similarly in a different way, or defining them in a different way, because they are responding to emergent literature or conversation practices in multi-species studies. So that was part of my motivation for writing this manifesto for multi-species art, but it also really framed the work I was doing in Loch Lomond. So I'll just read a couple of the points. There's 15 points in my. It seems very grand to call it the manifesto, but this is these might help to frame the two artworks that I'll go on to discuss. So for me, multi-species artworks are experimental objects, spaces, events, and performances designed to challenge conventional forms of understanding interspecies relations. And for me, multi-species art is a social practice, and we don't make multi-species artworks on our own. They engage communities of specialist environmental knowledge, recognizing their skills, motivations, and practices. Multi-species art, I believe, is conducted through sustained and equitable forms of collaboration, and it benefits from the knowledge, support, and enthusiasm of an extended community of expertise. And that's how I characterize my community that was created around the work in Loch Lomond. So multi-species art is a form of critical inquiry. I think it's a form of research, and it deploys research skills to investigate complex biopolitical relationships. So I think all multi-species artworks are about these kind of like complex push and pulls, where there's a lot of these decision-making and value relationships being navigated in conservation. Multi-species artworks can be created with and for both human and more than human participants. So I believe that animals, plants, and other living organisms can become the co-creators of an artwork participants, or the intended beneficiaries. And multi-species artworks are inherently concerned with ethics. So they avoid being destructive, extractive, or exploitative, and aim at more positive and equitable forms of interspecies interaction. And the final one that I'll highlight is that multi-species art, I believe, should unsettle conventional or standardized approaches to nature communication. So the communication of multi-species art should resist anthropocentrism, mapping alternative pathways to conceptualize and engage with more than human life. So these are some of the learnings that came directly out of the process of making the artworks in Loch Lomond. And now I think I'll go into sharing these two artworks. And I'll start with Mothcota. So Mothcota is a 4-meter tall shelter sculpture. It's made out of aluminium, a coir, a very fine hexagonal mesh. At the top, it has a blown acrylic sphere, which has a UV light inside, which is calibrated to be a wavelength attractive to a large variety of nocturnal Lepidoptera. It has a very small aperture that allows moths to enter into the internal space, in which there's a large stand filled with night flowering pollinators. And there's also a bench for human occupants to sit on. So I'm going to share 3 excerpts from a film that documents Mothcota's month-long installation in Loch Lomond. And while the film is playing, I'll talk more about the process, how I came to create the sculpture. I should say that the film was made by myself, cinematographer Andrew Begg, and sound designer Thomas Butler. But I'm not playing the sound today because I'm talking over the top, but hopefully there'll be an opportunity for you all to see the full film with the sound at another occasion. Why moths is probably a good starting point. When I began working in Loch Lomond, thinking about this question of how to engage visiting publics with forms of wildlife that may not be readily visible or accessible, easy to encounter. My fieldwork also coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic and the suspension of all conservation kind of activities, apart from moth recording. Interestingly, recording the prevalence of different moth species on site in Loch Lomond was one of the only, not the only, conservation activity that continued uninterrupted through the pandemic. And because of its accessibility, you don't need expensive equipment. You don't need to travel to remote locations. You can set a moth trap on your doorstep and have a very energizing and kind of intense nature encounter with the inhabitants of that moth trap. So it grew grew exponentially during the pandemic, and there was a real kind of energy and discussion around moth recording that I was able to engage with when I was remote from this site that I wanted to be embedded in doing my fieldwork. So I began a very detailed conversation with the warden who was on the site and alongside a community of amateur expert moth recorders, and I was able to really understand this very detailed, slow practice of taking each moth from the trap and identifying it and releasing it, and the skill and the observational intensity that involved. I've never kind of encountered that type of observational scrutiny before. The skill in the kind of minute differences in kind of the taxa of moths was really kind of quite incredible. And when I was eventually able to travel to Loch Lomond to do moth recording for myself, perhaps because of the confinement or because of the totally charismatic and fabulous nature of macro moths, it was the most kind of intense and energizing and incredibly transformative experience. And it really led me to pour all my energy and experiences into creating this artwork. So I wanted to bring this almost kind of privileged encounter that conservation practitioners have when they're doing a practice like moth recording to a larger audience. So these encounters with more than human creatures are often privileged to the people who have access to these sites, who have developed the skills to undertake this work. There's a certain degree of luck involved, but I wanted to create a space that could host this type of energizing encounter, but also create the conditions for a kind of polite, ethical form of encounter. In my research, I had some questions and some concerns about the ethics of moth recording generally. Just up the coast from my field site in Loch Lomond, there is a trap run as part of the national network of traps that is a lethal moth trap. So every day the moths are enter into a gas chamber and they die instantly, and they're recorded and disposed of. And that is the standardized practice for gathering data on the prevalence of moths, despite obviously the declining insect numbers. And I didn't want, I'm not necessarily saying that this is, I'm not trying to valorize one type of moth recording over another, but I wanted this artwork to open a dialogue around how we encounter other species and how this type of conservation recording work is done. So I had lots of questions about moth behavior and how to do this in an ethical way, how to make an artwork that could be a host for the sensory worlds of humans as well as the sensory worlds of these insects whose bodily architecture is totally different to our own. So we made a working group, and the working group is a device used in the RSPB. It's a common kind of structure for bringing lots of expertise together. But we had this fantastic working group with an artwork at its centre that involved entomologists and ecologists and wardens and volunteers from the RSPB, but also artwork fabricators and material specialists and filmmakers, and all different people involved in the project came to these meetings where we discussed each aspect of this artwork design, and ecology and ethics were a real focus for these meetings. So I like to think that we were kind of crafting a kind of multi-species ethics for the sculpture in those meetings, and they were robust. We were challenged in lots of different ways in terms of how the artwork could intersect with the kind of diurnal rhythms of moth life, how it could be sensitive to these moths' sensitivity to light and darkness, to shelter and openness. There was lots of different considerations in terms of the design of the sculpture, and it was a very iterative process in terms of I would present drawings and ideas and models, and then we would discuss very detailed elements of the materials and the form of the sculpture, of the event schedule, the way that potential visiting publics may interact with the artwork, and then I would redesign and redraft, and we would have the conversations again. So it was a really formative process, and really reshaped how I think about collaboration and kind of embedding that kind of deep ecological understanding that comes from working on a site or with a species for your whole career. How can that kind of deep understanding be embedded into an artwork, into the process? So the moth coater was installed in July 2021, throughout the month of July, and I was its kind of sole caretaker over that period. We were still living in the pandemic, and I undertook kind of a lot of labour in terms of opening the sculpture and kind of tending to the moths, recording the moths, hosting the human participants, cleaning the sculpture, gathering the pollinators, and I write in my thesis about this care labour and how significant it was that I was undertaking this labour, all different parts of the day and night through that month, and spending so much time on my own in the woods with this sculpture. And I talk about the how we make space, capacity, funding, support for the caring labour that is involved in this type of multi-species project. But I also talk about the fact that the learning for me was in the care labour, that so much of my understanding about the sculpture and the ecology of the woodland was gained through that time and through that physical work, which for me also mirrored the physical work that I could see my conservation colleagues doing on the site. So there's definitely a mirroring between that kind of hard labour that's involved in trying to research and conserve these communities, and kind of what I was wanting the artwork to kind of mirror and to investigate. So people were offered 3 different experiences of moth coater. They could come at night when it was illuminated, and they could sit inside as moths flew around the sphere, the moon-like sphere at the apex, and down into the space, and kind of would settle on different kind of shelter spaces within the artwork. They could come in the daytime when the moths were kind of resting inside in the dappled light of the woodland and sit with the sculpture, or they could come for a more kind of facilitated experience the following evening when all the side panels are lowered to the ground, and as dusk fell, people would be able to see the moths starting to reanimate like this, potentially nectaring on all the gathered night flowering pollinators and dispersing back into the woodland. So there's some experiences and some kind of very close, intimate encounters with moth life facilitated by those events and by the structure, by the sculpture that aren't always accessible to the visiting publics, to the nature reserve. And I gathered lots of kind of feedback, impressions from this, and many people spoke about the effect on their mental well-being of being in this space, and how it's slowed them and made them aware of these forms of life that they often move past or wouldn't consider during the daylight hours. So I think we're probably a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to move swiftly through the second artwork, which is the kind of balancing component of my PhD project. So after I made Moth Coater, I turned my attention to the community of Greenland white-fronted geese that overwinter in Loch Lomond. So these geese are significant to the Loch Lomond Nature Reserve because they guide a lot of its conservation decisions. They are red list kind of endangered species. The Loch Lomond flock are approximately 1% of the global population. They're having a lot of difficulties in terms of their breeding in Greenland. They face lots of risks in their staging grounds in Iceland. So I wanted to make an artwork that engaged with the complex lives of this community of geese. And what you're looking at here is a collage. As part of my PhD submission, I described the process of making one artwork in a kind of very detailed textual form, and I described the process of making another in a purely visual, almost purely visual collage form to show the kind of many iterative kind of potentials of creative research, this kind of big cloud of material that you're kind of working within to navigate. There's always many different ways a project can go, and I thought that collage was a way of capturing some of that kind of richness of the material generated by a project such as this. So my first experiences of these geese were through dawn goose roost surveys, and I was really fascinated by the skill of my conservation colleagues in being able to identify geese as they flew in their hundreds and thousands sometimes above our heads, and being able to untangle their vocalizations and count them in the half light of dawn. It's quite an amazing skill to behold. So I was really trying to address how I was going to engage the public in Loch Lomond with these geese, which are often absent when they're not in Loch Lomond. They're either in Iceland or Greenland, but often when they are in Loch Lomond, they're hiding from human presence, and actually to get close to the geese is to really distress them. So ideally we don't want to come into close proximity with them, and I thought a lot about this idea of proximity and how perhaps we can have a rich engagement with another species without necessarily being physically in proximity to them. So how could I make an artwork that engaged with this species in a different way? This led me to think about migration. I knew that the artwork would have to engage with this epic migration that the geese take from Loch Lomond, stopping in Iceland, and then going to the west coast of Greenland. So I began to look into this network of conservation, all these people who are working to understand the lives of these geese across different countries and land masses and time zones, and thinking about remote sensing technologies. So some of the geese wear tags that now give us this intimate insight into their lives when they are floating in the water through a storm, unable to fly, or having to walk through an Arctic storm across an ice sheet in Greenland. So we now have some a really amazing insight into their lives when they're not in Loch Lomond. And I played with the idea of making a sculpture that was a kind of a take on an antennae used in this type of work. But my real breakthrough with this project was when I realized that I wanted to make an artwork that would help visitors predict or anticipate the migration of these birds and tune into their seasonal patterns of presence and absence. And for this, I learnt an ancient art form of sundial making, because I realised that sundials don't only tell us the time of day; they can be calibrated to tell us a particular, or to signify a particular significant date. So because I was working kind of embedded with the RSPB, I was able to access their archives of geese arriving and departing from the reserve over many seasons, and I was able to identify the kind of average first arrival time and average last arrival time, and the same with their departure. And from that, I got these seasonal migration windows, and I was then able to knowing the angle of the sun on those dates, and thinking about the height of a gnomon, you can then predict the shadow length, where the shadow will fall on those particular days. And the skein dial, as it was called, was created in Corten steel. It's a permanent artwork now installed in the Loch Lomond Reserve. Like Mothcote, it was brought together by a skilled group in collaboration with structural engineers and mathematicians and fabricators and metalworkers and goose recorders. We had really fascinating meetings with all those different expertise. And the artwork was installed on a very particular day to coincide with these migration windows. So I'll have another go at explaining it, because it's so the artwork, the gnomon of the artwork, so the part that casts the shadow, in this case is actually the gap between the two metal plates, the two Corten plates of the sculpture. So the gnomon is actually the shaft of light that moves across the ground over the course of the day. And the two plates of skein dial are perforated with a skein of geese. So this shadow skein kind of moves across the ground over the course of the day with the sun, just as the many thousands of geese fly over your head in the morning and the evening when they are resident in Loch Lomond. So when we are approaching the spring and autumn migration, the shadow of the gnomon will fall within the arc. So you can see perhaps in this top diagram that between the 10th and 20th of March, the geese are in the process of leaving Loch Lomond. So they have just left. We've just they will now be in Iceland. So the shadow of the sculpture during those dates will fall within the spring arc, and then people will know to look to the skies and see those geese departing. And then when the shadow is longer in the autumn, and it falls in the autumn arc between the 5th of October and the 26th of October, people know to look to the skies, because the geese will be arriving back from Greenland and Iceland into Loch Lomond. So the artwork was really designed as a way of tuning audiences in to this seasonal pattern, to get them to look to the skies, to be aware, and also a bit like Mothcote, I wanted it to open up this quite kind of specialist practice. So there's this kind of wonder-filled skill of predicting migration for an audience who might not necessarily have that kind of access or previous experience to be able to do that. So yes, I'm conscious I perhaps run over time, so I'm happy to talk about any more of those as the discussion develops. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you. That was wonderful. Fantastic. Diane, I think we've got you back again. Is that right? Can you put your camera on if you're back?
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are. Okay, fantastic. Well, wonderful presentations, both of you. Thank you so very, very much. I mean, just fabulous. I'm sure we have all kinds of questions or things that people would like to say. So here's the part of our afternoon where we're going to be able to allow for that to happen. So With Genevieve's help, I'm going to be able to kind of field some of these questions or comments. So anybody want to start? Yeah, Ian, you would like to start.
Thank you both very much for fascinating and very thought-provoking presentations. One of the things that strikes me is that language is really important for the work that you're doing. Being able to find terms for the kind of inclusive understanding that is necessary. And it seems to me that we have a particular problem in English. I realize that both Scots Gaelic and Welsh have a vocabulary that allows them to talk about this more effectively than English does. But there's obviously a problem. How do we find a new vocabulary to talk about these terms that are available in languages that have been marginalized by English?
Good question, Ian. And I just want to express my appreciation for the work, Hannah, that you spoke so beautifully about, and the concepts that you bring into your artwork, and the way you interweave multi-species with art practices. And I love the presentation. I apologize for dropping out briefly. It's rural internet, so I may have to rewatch this a little bit. But back to your question, Ian, language is something that I wrestle with constantly. And in my own life and practice, I have put a particular emphasis on breaking down conceptual terms that into practical application. So, for example, reading books about relationship with the land, a common phrase would be decolonizing our relationship with land, for example. And so I want to know, well, what does that look like in the morning when I get up? How do I begin that practice of decolonizing? What tool do I need? What are the activities? And so for me, part of it is moving from what is abstract terms that we use so often in written stories into a more practical, hands-on, specific language that I can apply to the work. And then the other aspect for me that's very important is to be careful of language that feels judgmental. So invasive species, for example, is I think a particularly harmful way of describing any plant. That a plant is in an environment that it has often been used in a way that opens up an opportunity for that plant to be overly enthusiastic. But that is not a fault of the plant. This is not a negative side of its personality that emerges. So those are two aspects that I pay attention to. I'll turn it over to Hannah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating and difficult question. Thank you, Ian. I think there's one point maybe I'll pick up on from my writing. I was thinking about language a lot when it came to the communication of multi-species art in partnership, which is the context that I was in. I was making this artwork within the RSPB, but obviously I was engaged with these forms of scholarship which are challenging the conventions of how we talk about the more than human world. So challenging the word nature, or challenging kind of some of these terms like invasive species. Diane, I think that's a really important one. So it was quite a difficult position for me in a way to be working simultaneously with this kind of academic discussion that was challenging how we think about like how we verbalize our relationship with the natural world, and this kind of mass appeal type writing that the RSPB would be doing to promote its various activities, where they will use nature capital N as standard, and they will write they will often they're not wanting to use experimental terms. They're wanting to use kind of established, accessible language, and there was a real kind of conflict for me in terms of that, or a dissonance between those two ways of articulating, and where did the sculpture sit within that, and how it, and what was my role in terms of presenting it and navigating those two kind of two worlds or two vocabularies. So I tried to address that in the thesis, kind of tease it apart and not necessarily offer a clear solution, but offer some of the ways that I navigated it or challenged it or may do it differently in the future. Yeah, I'll open it up. Other people can come in on that too.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It looks like we've got a question from Eleanor.
Hi. Oh, thank you both for such interesting talks. I really enjoyed both of them. One term, kind of keeping on that kind of language theme, one term that can sometimes have negative connotations is intervention. And it struck me as you were both talking, you were both dealing with presences and absences, but you were both involved with making interventions of some sort, making decisions for Diane about kind of halting succession to sustain or create the habitat you wanted to achieve. And Hannah, you were kind of making interventions in relation to actually placing objects in the landscape. And my question is quite an easy one, really. I just wanted to ask you both, in making those decisions around interventions, did anything surprise you as practitioners, as individuals?
Do you want to go, Hannah?
If you have something, Diane, I'm still
thinking. Yeah. Well,
challenging.
First thought the thought is about that word intervention, and it's one that I do sometimes use, but I try to shift myself toward thinking of collaboration instead, that what I'm doing on the land is collaborating with various plants and animals and circumstances. And it is, I'm trying to be very intentional about my place on that land, that so that I don't overstep what is my sense of being human and fall into the trap of hubris. I know what's best, when in fact these communities that I'm engaging with are so complex that this is why generations of people have worked to share their and maintain their knowledge about these practices. So I feel like I'm very new, very ignorant, and I think for me it's overcoming my fear of actually doing anything and making it worse has been the door that has opened me up to continual surprise of what actually happens then. So I'm in a state of constant amazement at what the cause and effect of my of my actions?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I feel like there are always so many unexpected things, and for me, I wouldn't have made the artworks that I did if I knew what was going to happen through placing them in those contexts. That they were kind of exploratory objects that enabled all these different interactions and learnings. That I couldn't foresee all the things that could, because that was part of the purpose of the object. It was and really, when I first sighted Mothkota, even though I had been speaking to an optical physicist about the refractive properties of the materials I was working with and how they would relate to the wavelengths that were stimulating to Lepidoptera, there was all these different intricacies of how moths may interact with this novel environment. But I still didn't know if any would come, or how they would inhabit it, or how it would affect their behaviour. And so I came down that first morning after setting it, thinking there might be nothing here. Like I might have made this huge folly, this big, as someone called it, like the shuttlecock in the woodland that might have not done anything. So it was. As all my sculptures are, like a prototype, a test, and yes, it facilitated all these like really intimate, kind of amazingly charged interactions that I hadn't been able to foresee. And actually, some of the best feedback I had was from moth recorders who'd been coming to that woodland for many years, who were really excited because they were seeing things and experiencing moths in this kind of open way that they hadn't in the kind of the small black plastic moth trap they usually have. So they were discovering things that was energizing and exciting them. So I think that was one of the most gratifying things, that it wasn't just kind of providing revelations for me. It was like the sculpture was facilitating this new types of encounter and information for those who were actually kind of really knowledgeable and about those species in that place.
You know, Eleanor, I did have a thought too when about what did surprise me was when the first year when Chris Baumler and I hosted the International Bog Day out here on the land, and we invited all these people, and I thought, well, I don't know if people even care. I mean, bogs have for so many years been treated as a form of wasteland to be converted into something productive. And so what surprised me was that people really did care, and that they really wanted to have an opportunity to be in a different kind of relationship with the land. So that when I asked them to bring a gift, something that came from their heart, it could be a poem or a song or whatever they felt moved to create. What surprised me was the depth of commitment people brought to that. And then we shared it all. So we had a microphone set up, and we had a bassoon player come. We had poets, teachers came with lots of information about bogs. And I think this is a really important opportunity for us to acknowledge, is that people are hungry for the opportunity to be in a more engaged relationship. So thank you for that question.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Hannah, did you want to add something there? No. Okay. Well, we had a comment in the chat from Chris. Chris, do you want to come in and say something?
Coming. Sorry. Yeah, no, it's been such a fabulous discussion, presentations. I'm sorry I was late in, so I didn't hear all of yours, Diane, but I got a good sense of it, and both of them, they're remarkable work, and real pleasure to hear that. I suppose it was Ian's question about language. and of course language is constantly changing. So actually the problem with English is that it's at the forefront of first industrialization and then technology and so on. So actually the English language has been moving away from nature fast and hard over 200 years. So I'm not sure that the English language wasn't capable in the past. I think it's simply been at the forefront of a shift, which is interesting. And what I was just it was again interesting in relation to the problem of language and post-colonial and all of these things. I heard Suzanne Lacey talking last week, and she was kind of going, yeah, well, that critical theory is great, but actually the critical pedagogy is what matters. That's where the rubber hits the road. And I just thought that was so in a way so relevant to that problem. How do we teach it? Not how do we think it? How do we teach it? How do we engage? How do we learn it? So that was it. Thank you again. I'm gonna have to go and walk the dog now. So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the reminder. Thank you for keeping doing this. I hope there's more of it, and I look forward to participating in more of it because it's great.
Thank you, Chris. Can we, is our observations or answers that you would like to respond with, Diane or Hannah? To Chris's point about education?
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, education and practice. I think that for me, it was so vital to have a PhD that was rooted in a place where this work was being actively undertaken. It wasn't environmental philosophy. It wasn't working with the theory of these kind of complex biopolitical decisions that are being made. I was seeing the wrestle of like how do we make a decision that puts the lives of one species above another when we're like there's so many like really complex, difficult decisions involved in just everyday on the ground environmental conservation work, and how does art engage with that rather than simplifying it or kind of doing a simplistic critique. How do you get into all those decisions and the skill and the knowledge that are informing it, but also and try and kind of open that conversation to a broader community through art practice. So yes, I would just add practice and pedagogy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would add the process that I've gone through here on my land of starting by reading books, and they would all say decolonize your relationships, and that's where I went to. Okay, what does that look like in the morning, and then coming to and then not wanting to also go rely on the expert model. I didn't want to just bring people in who could say, "Oh, do this and this," or "We'll do it for you," and there I am, still as ignorant. So how would I make a real authentic relationship with the land? And what came to me, the most useful tool then is phenology. So that in a practice of observing every day the changes, what is nature actually up to out there? And if I do something, if I act in a way that makes a change, then what is the response? And so phenology to me is the way, and that's the point where I'm learning to re-engage in that relationship with land.
Yeah.
Oh, I totally agree, Diane. Phenology is where I'm at too. This is how I came to frame these two works in the PhD. I was thinking that what came to be the most important is thinking about these actions that we repeat again and again, that to understand how things are changing, how the lives of these different creatures intersect with each other, with our actions, and the nature reserve is the training ground for that work. Like that's where the next generation of people are being trained in the skillful practices required to do that phenological surveying, monitoring, just observing, looking with our eyes, appreciating the world around us. I learned so much from the warden because at Loch Lomond, because he's an incredible naturalist and he doesn't talk in jargon, but he knows every bird that comes every season and exactly where it nests and what it does, and how its call differs from the one that nests in that hedge two fields down, and his observational skills are really inspired so much of kind of my experiences and the artwork. So I think phenology is so important as our climate changes and things are getting out of sync, and just that we are trying to make work, to make sculpture, to make writing that engages people in these seasonal observations that are at the root of nature appreciation and therefore how we care and advocate for these spaces.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Just an observation before Ian's question is that for both of you, both Diane and Hannah, today in your presentations, you were absolutely linking a kind of action, being in the land, working with things, working with materials, observing, noting, interacting, and then using your art to reflect upon these aspects that come through that slow process of being and doing. And that the kind of writing process is a way of sharing with a much wider audience those kinds of lessons and kinds of knowledge that accrues gradually through these processes of actions, of being in place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, that's my observation. Ian, you're over to you. You had a question.
It's not really a question. It's to reinforce but I think what you're both saying, which is about education and listening. And I was thinking about this whole business of decolonizing and remembering that when I was a child, having a conversation with a gamekeeper in the Highlands, and just talking about what we could see and where we were. And I referred to the rhododendrons. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, you mean the gentry weed?" And it was such a wonderful description of something that I'd always been taught was very beautiful and associated with, wealthy people's gardens and so on and so forth. But of course, it was actually a brilliant observation because it's an imported species that grows like crazy and was entirely dependent on rich landowners bringing it into the country. And it wasn't a judgment, it was simply a redescription of something. So I think maybe my earlier comments about English were only half right, that actually if we listen to vernacular English, we maybe get some of the change in vocabulary that we need, or at least it gives us a different way of thinking about what we see and experience.
And I suppose for me as a visual artist, I would always advocate for that can't be expressed through words, that there is nuance in the experience of an artwork and in the encounters with the natural world that can be facilitated through an artwork that transcends some of what you can express verbally for me. So I think that in the documentation of my artwork, I'm always trying to kind of to capture something that it's hard to articulate, that kind of sublime moment of encounter, which I think energizes the people who encounter the artwork, but it's also at the root of what sustains kind of conservation practice and volunteer labor, is these kind of sublime moments of encounter with the natural world, that they energize us and they give us energy for this really difficult work of restoration and care. And I think, there's a lot in that can't be captured, or it's hard to capture.
Are there any other questions or observations or comments? Oh, Catherine.
Hi, Mary. I couldn't find the button. So sorry. So great talks. I myself am working in a bog in Ireland, so I'm really loving all the conversations about like connecting to the land and being connected to a place and thinking through making, because my ideas are practice led, and I just want to get back to what you're saying, because I also teach, and what you were talking about, like the pedagogy and the idea of language and teaching through making. And during COVID, I think you mentioned COVID, that you were in, Hannah, you were in that site and you were kind of focused in with the mock because of COVID, because it was the access. And I kind of led into the bog through COVID too. It was kind of like a space that I felt like, I could really see what was going on in the planet, because the beaches were full of people walking dogs, and it was nobody really goes to the bog unless it's for a journey of labor. And I have childhood memories too of working in the bog, so I know both sides of it. So I'm kind of tied to that ruralness of like, being the person that cut and foot the turf as a child and bagging it, and also to the person then that like, wants the bog to be this beautiful kind of space to enjoy. And this whole thing, I have this kind of philosophy about this rural campus, and this idea that like, that we could like come outside of the white cube and go out and be outside. It was just really lovely to hear both of your practices, that you're outside and you're engaging, making work. And do you think there's any future for colleges or pedagogy that we could actually facilitate these kind of ideas, not as projects, but as an actual thing that could happen, that like, people who are interested in ecology or in place, in the environment, in land, that there could be, spaces within these colleges to actually, be active and be connected. And also to Ian, what you were saying about the language, I've kind of discovered a lot of languages talking to the older farmer. And it's just like, it's so beautiful when you get the translation of the word that, it's anglicized, and then you hear the Irish and then the translation. And there's just something in that too. And Manka McGann, who passed away there last year, he wrote a beautiful book about like, well, all of these books are really great, but he wrote one book too about like, is it 40 words for field, or so many words for field. But it's like, it's just beautiful to just read some of his writing about language, and about like how he talks about like, the differences between what we say and what we mean. And yeah. So that was it. I don't know if I had a question there. I suppose it was about the rural campus.
Catherine, we need to bring back hedge schools.
Oh, I listen. I'm there. Somebody actually did a project on the hedge schools in Sherkin Island. Sherkin Island has an art college out there. It's a weekend, and they do this thing called Sherkin, do the hedge schools. So yes, but I do think we do need to come back out, because it's the only way that you understand is actually spending time in a space, and spending time. Like, I've been in and out of that bog for 4 years, so I understand what everybody's saying when they say you notice things changing, just very simple things. And there's only certain times that the land lets you in, because it's flooded or there's walkway, and then you have to kind of become familiar with it. So it's not like making with it or making on, it's like making with. It's that whole philosophy of thinking with the land than against it.
Catherine, can you tell us the name of the farmer again? His book.
Oh, sorry, no, he wasn't a farmer. It was Mankan McGann. It was he is an Irish writer, but he passed away this year. But it's Mankan, M-A. I'm not very good at spelling now. M-A-G-A-N, Mankan. Yeah, but I don't know if I have his book here beside me. I have so many books on the floor. But he's M-A-C-H-A-N, then it's Manka McGann, M-A-C-H-A-N. But yeah, he's wrote loads of books about about the connection to our ancestors.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the reference.
Yeah.
Somebody else wanted to say something. I saw a hand briefly, then it disappeared. Is there anybody else who would like to say something or ask a question? Or I can't see any hands here. Well, looks like we're maybe going to wrap up just a little bit early then this afternoon. But we can't thank you enough, Hannah and Diane. Fabulous presentations today. Food for thought for all of us. And we're going to build, I know, on many more conversations yet to come that weaves these thoughts and ideas through. So I just want to say a massive thank you on behalf of everybody for your generosity today in sharing your work and research with us. So let's everybody give a clap, a hand, and say thank you once again. Hand on heart, wonderful, wonderful presentations today. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll stop the recording now, but thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. And Diane and Hannah, I'll be in touch as well. Okay, thank you everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye.